Even as the stakes for succeeding in education get higher and higher every year, we're still choosing a mode of teaching that we know only works well for a minority of our children, and it's killing us. It's time to start talking about the most revolutionary option on the table: unleashing our superpower.
Nothing, absolutely nothing, approaches the effectiveness of tutoring.
It would be really hard to find an educational intervention that has the same rigorous research base and potential to improve student outcomes as tutoring does.
Tutoring, lots and lots of tutoring. That is going to put them way, way ahead.
Welcome to Tutoring the Human Superpower. I'm Giles Leeper. When you think of West Virginia, maybe the words education revolution are not the first words that come to mind. But there was at least one shining example in the history of education in West Virginia. There was a time in the race between rising complexity and the cost of education when education in West Virginia was crushing it. My great-grandfather, Lorimer Cavins, just happened to be there for this momentous occasion. And really, he was a full participant in it. In fact, he documented the moment meticulously in all of its glory for us today. This document that he created, called The Financing of Education in West Virginia, published in 1925, has become a very important document for me. Not only because he's my ancestor, but because this is not an event that we ever learn about in history class. There are no famous people in this story. It's not even a gripping story about people fighting oppression. It's just a boring story about money and teaching and learning. I wouldn't be telling you this story except that the consensus in academia that has emerged in the last 30 years is that this event that my great-grandfather Lorimer Cavins participated in was one small chapter in a much larger event that changed absolutely everything. In fact, given how important scholars think it was, it's shocking to me that we still don't teach our children about it. And I know it's kind of clickbait to say something changed absolutely everything. People like to claim that kind of thing all the time. But in this case, I'm not exaggerating. The education revolution in West Virginia was, of course, a microcosm of something that swept the whole country, and then the entire developed world. In fact, this event, to an extent, determined who was in the developed world and who wasn't. And because of it, truly, the world will never be the same. This event is commonly called the high school movement, but as we're about to see, to my great-grandfather, it was about far more than just building new high schools. If we ever want there to be more education revolutions in the future, I think we need to study the education revolutions of the past. How did this one happen? If we understand the sheer ridiculousness that became a reality in the past, maybe we can do it again. For me, the story of this education revolution in West Virginia, even though it was only a temporary one, is an inspiring and hopeful tale. And by the way, you can see this report for yourself. In fact, it's free and it's online. It's even been made into a Google book. I'll link it in the show notes. My great-grandfather, Lorimer Cavins, was born in Illinois in 1880. At that time, Illinois was pretty prosperous, but West Virginia was one of the least educated states in the country and also one of the poorest. The common schools movement had swept the country, but the Southern elites had been resisting investing in education more than any other region. So the nation was spending an average of about 7 years in school at that time, but that was, of course, lower in West Virginia. After Grandpa Cavins earned his PhD from Harvard in statistics, he got an opportunity to go down and help out in West Virginia's Department of Education. The department was underfunded, but the Rockefeller Foundation paid his way down there and covered his salary. So what could a guy with a background in statistics do for a state like West Virginia in the mid-1920s? Well, for one thing, he could count stuff. He could use numbers to figure out what the heck was going on in the state. Because actually nobody knew at that time. States only had a very small role in public education. The federal Department of Education, of course, was not involved at all because it didn't even exist until 1979. Public education was almost entirely a local community affair. So nobody exactly knew what was happening in the state. So Grandpa Cavins spent 2 years going around West Virginia, corresponding with district leaders and studying their records. He looked at the finances and tried to figure out how much money they were spending, of course. But also, he wanted to know how educated were the teachers? What conditions were the school buildings in? How many years were kids spending in school before they were dropping out? He tracked changes by studying the numbers in 1915 and then comparing them to 1925. And what he found was that a grassroots, bottom-up revolution was already in full swing that had nothing to do with the Rockefeller Foundation or the folks working in the ed department. It was the local communities. These tiny districts, without any prompting from outside, were in a state of complete overhaul. Okay, first, let's talk about the money. The money for public education was exploding in a way that has never happened since I've been alive. It's shocking. He found that tiny local communities were independently deciding to spend far more money on schooling than had ever been spent on their own schooling. Before going into the actual numbers, he introduced them by offering some context in order to sort of defend the grassroots movement that was already well underway. And he used words that sound eerily familiar to me. He wrote, "When we reflect upon the changes that have taken place in the economical, political, and social world, and upon the complexities of our present-day society, we see at once the magnitude of the problem of educating 400,000 boys and girls to take their places in this intricate civilization. The importance of training the leadership of future generations only serves to remind us of the millions of dollars that have been lost and are now being lost because of the state's neglect in the past." He revealed the numbers. In 1925, West Virginians were paying 350% more money on their local public schools than they had done in the year 1915. In just 10 years, they had more than doubled the percent of all of their money that they were spending on public schools. And for comparison's sake, in my lifetime, since 1977, the percent of our money that we spend on public education has actually gone down. Then he wrote this: "Some readers will see in a study of tables of costs only the increased burden that education is heaping upon the taxpayers of the state. Others will see in the same tables the marked changes that are daily taking place in the intellectual and moral capacities of the boys and girls for whom this money is spent. The point with which we are concerned in this investigation, I take it, is not how much money West Virginia is spending, but what is she getting for the money she spends?" In other words, what was the money paying for? Well, here's what he found. For one thing, the money was paying for better teachers. In 1915, less than 20% of the teachers had graduated from high school. In 1925, 50% of the teachers had a high school degree and either had a college degree or a certificate from a teacher training institution called a normal school. That is a huge transformation. Another thing it was paying for was kids spending a lot more time in school. The old common practice of kids dropping out after first grade to work on the farm was fading. West Virginia was still behind the rest of the country in terms of enrollment, but it was catching up. Kids were staying in school longer. And for those that stayed in school, the school year was also getting longer. Many of the mountain school districts only went to school for about 3 months of the year in 1915. That was the norm. But not so much in 1925. Many of these tiny little mountain school districts had decided to move towards more school days in the year. After decades of stagnation, the average number of days in the school year had increased by 20% in just 5 years. And there was a movement away from the old one-room schoolhouse and towards the modern school buildings. Those one-room schoolhouses can sound nostalgic and idyllic to some of us today, but according to my Grandpa Cavins statistics, One half of the kids who went to those one-room schoolhouses dropped out after first grade. By 1925, more than half of the kids were actually going to buildings that we would recognize as modern-day school buildings, and those kids were staying in school longer. Between 1915 and 1925, high school enrollment had more than doubled. Its 7% graduation rate in 1925 was still behind the rest of the nation, which was at 10%. But soon it would double, and then it would double again, and again. 50 years later, West Virginians would be spending almost 3 times as many years in school on average than they had been doing in the early 1900s. It's hard to deny that the money they were spending at this time, a time when education spending was increasing faster than ever before or since, they were buying something of real value and importance. And I can't stress this enough. This revolution did not happen because of the Rockefeller Foundation. It wasn't even because of West Virginia Department of Education. This was truly a democratic, grassroots, bottom-up revolution. Nobody was making these towns and rural counties keep their kids in school longer. No one was telling them how qualified their teachers need to be. Nobody made them build hundreds of new high schools. Nobody even had that authority. Every tiny little district had to have its own reasons for wanting to invest more of its money into education. There was a national education revolution happening, and this time West Virginia refused to be left behind. The end of his report is devoted to how some districts were still far behind the rest. Some of the very poorest kids were still only spending 3 months of the year in school, still had teachers with only an 8th grade education, still had those one-room schoolhouses without any running water or electricity, and had no high school anywhere near them. This was a problem that Grandpa Cavins had a lot of ideas for how to help. And after he wrote this report, that's what he dedicated his time and energy to. For example, getting buses to take those kids from their tiny villages to nearby wealthier towns, where they could have more of a 20th century education experience. By the way, I don't have time for it in this episode, but I just want to say that the participation of Black people in this revolution, both in West Virginia and in the rest of the nation, is an extremely important and powerful and inspiring story that I will come back to in a different episode. I never met my great-grandfather, but I feel very connected to him, especially when I hear him harping on about the importance of preparing kids for the rising complexity of a new world that is changing politically, economically, and socially. He died in the 1940s before he could really see the fruits of his labor come to fruition. There was a Great Depression and then a horrific World War before things began to really take off for West Virginia. But he's left us a little time capsule in the form of what seemed to me at first to be a very dull report. I was wrong. It's hard to imagine that a report called The Financing of Education in West Virginia could be so insightful. But what I've realized that it is a record of how regular, everyday people revolutionized education before, so that one day we can do it again. If we're ever going to unleash our superpower, there are some lessons we can learn from this. And here are the lessons that I've taken from this report. First of all, I think it's important that it was a grassroots, bottom-up change. And I'm not alone. Historians view America's local control over public education as one of the primary reasons that America led the world in public education for so long. Because it allowed for local experimentation without these politicians getting involved. It allowed good ideas to spread organically instead of top down from a Department of Education or a state superintendent. Then, after the movement had already come into full swing, that's when state government started to play an important role. At the end of the movement, they came in to help those children growing up in the laggard communities, the ones that just weren't keeping up with the rest. That was an important role, but also staying out of the way of those innovative early adopter communities was also equally important. Second, I think it was important that it was a slow revolution. Looking back on it, it kind of seems like it was fast and radical. But radical changes like this one only seem radical in hindsight. If I were alive at that time, I probably would have found the pace of change to be painfully slow. But slowness does have its virtues. I touched on this in episode 6. These revolutions require a lot of money and talent, and slowness allows both of those to sort of snowball and increase slowly over time. Cultures don't change quickly, but slowness allows cultural shifts to take place. If we're ever going to unleash our superpower, it will also be a slow, grassroots, organic process. Third, it had to start with some really zealous people. People who were really passionate about public education. The education fanatics played an important role in this story. There's nothing to suggest that West Virginia would have independently launched this revolution if it wasn't already proving successful elsewhere, especially in New England. West Virginia was not particularly educationally innovative itself, but they saw that it was working elsewhere, and that's what allowed them to willingly agree to much higher taxes to support education. If we're ever going to unleash our superpower or start another education revolution by any other means, it's probably going to start again in some highly zealous education communities that are willing to spend more of their money on education. And it'll only spread from there when and if it proves to be highly successful and worth the money. The fourth lesson I take away is that education progress is a worthwhile thing to invest in, if it actually leads to more people becoming more able to thrive amid rising complexity. My great-grandfather applauded West Virginians for their 350% increases in education spending in just 10 years. He predicted that it would be beneficial to the economic, political, and social future of West Virginia, and he was right. Let's just talk about regular, everyday wages. During this revolution, West Virginia's average wages doubled. And then they doubled again. And then again. By the end of this revolution, average West Virginians made 8 times more money than they had made at the beginning of it. Their wages grew faster than in Massachusetts and New York. From 1915 to 1980, West Virginians lived longer and longer lives. Their Appalachian culture became nationally recognized as having value and importance. Income inequality there shrunk. West Virginians stood a very good chance of doing better than their parents. And in 1980, average wages in West Virginia were higher than the national average. Of course, educational progress was not the only reason for all of this. But can you imagine what would have happened if West Virginia had kept its 19th century education system while the rest of the nation left it in the dust? But my fifth lesson, and my final takeaway, is unfortunately the darkest one. If we do unleash our superpower, we should not expect it to be the last education revolution that we will ever need, unless we find a way to get a grip on rising complexity. West Virginia's fortunes were brightened by this education revolution, but it ended. After the 1970s, it was over, but the complexification of our society did not stop rising at that time. Millions of West Virginians benefited, but the ones who were least well suited to 20th century classroom learning did not manage to benefit as much as the ones who were well suited to it. And today, those people are struggling. Income inequality, after shrinking for the first part of the 20th century, has been growing again since the 1980s, because almost all the new economic growth has been captured by the most educated people in West Virginia. For people who couldn't make it through college, wages have actually gone down since the 1970s. Millions of them have dropped out of the workforce entirely. Mental health is in a state of crisis. Deaths from drug overdose, alcohol, suicides, they have all been rising since the 1980s, affecting the least educated most. It was a mistake to ever think that the 20th century education model, as amazing as it was when it came, could ever have been enough for all time. What I think this story shows is that it's just never okay to stop trying our hardest to make sure that the next generations are smarter than we are. I'm jealous of my great-grandfather. He got to live through the event that made his children's generation and his grandchildren's generation more educated than his own generation. He did this by helping to make sure that far more of the next generations had the same privileges that his own kids and grandkids already had. Schools with college-educated teachers that stay in session longer than 3 months of the year. High-quality school buildings with plumbing and electricity. Free high schools near enough to go to. It's not too late to start studying these forgotten moments of local community heroism so that we can revive an old tradition, but making sure that more of the next generation has the same privileges that our own children have. Thanks for listening, and as always, you can reach me at gilesleeper.com.